Hello everyone, my name is Rachel and welcome to part 2 of the Korey Kauffman case. Now, if you have not watched part 1, make sure you go ahead and watch that video before diving into part 2. There is so much information that we went over in part 1 that is imperative to understanding before we dive into part 2. In part 1, we introduced Korey and we talked about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and death. Then we discussed 8 other people who are thought to be involved in this entire web of changing stories, hiding evidence, and possibly involving themselves in this entire cover-up. Today, we will be discussing the trials, their outcomes, and what happened as a result of all of this. But before we get into the case, I need to go ahead and say a huge thank you to today's sponsor, GlassesUSA.com. If you're anything like me and you are pretty much blind like me, you know how expensive it can be and how much of a hassle it can be to get your glasses directly from your eye doctor. But GlassesUSA.com has now made that process so much easier and so much more affordable. By cutting out the middleman, GlassesUSA.com offers prescription eyeglasses up to 70% off of retail prices. You can now shop for your prescription eyeglasses online, at home, all at affordable prices. GlassesUSA.com has over 4,000 styles of glasses and sunglasses, including in-home brands like Amelia E, which is what I'm wearing right now. I love these glasses, as well as Audito, which is what these glasses are, another one of my favorite brands. Then I also have my super cute pink pair of Muse sunglasses, which I wear pretty much every single day. I love having extra pairs of glasses and sunglasses. I always keep a pair of sunglasses in my purse as well as in my car. I always have a pair of eyeglasses in my nightstand, in my bathroom, and my overnight bag. I just need to have glasses or sunglasses with me at all times. I have very sensitive eyes to the sun, so I always need sunglasses if I'm going to be driving. I also need my eyeglasses in case I ended up sleeping over at a friend's house or something like that and I forget my glasses. I always have a pair with me, whether it be in my car or in my overnight bag. GlassesUSA.com also has designer brands like Ray-Ban, Oakley, Gucci, and so many more. You can find any style and color that you can imagine, as well as specialty glasses like kids glasses, sports glasses, safety glasses, and so many more. Also with GlassesUSA.com, you can add any type of prescription to almost any pair of frames, including sunglasses and blue light blocking glasses for those of us who are pretty much always staring at a screen, whether it be at work, on a computer, or on our phones. One of my favorite features that GlassesUSA.com offers is their try-on feature, where you put in a picture of yourself to see how the glasses will actually look on you before you spend the money to buy them, which is really helpful when you aren't quite sure exactly how they'll look on you before you buy them. The best part, of course, is the price point. A pair of glasses starts at only $30 and free basic prescription lenses are included in every frame. It's so easy. All you do is enter your prescription online, you place your order, and that's it. You're done. You sit back and relax and wait for your glasses to arrive directly to your front door. Standard shipping is free on all orders, no matter how much you spend. And if for some reason you aren't happy with your order, you have 14 days to return it for a refund, 100% store credit, or an exchange, completely hassle-free and no questions asked. The exciting news is that when you click the link down in my description box below, my subscribers can get up to 65% off of their first order, which is such a great deal considering that their glasses are already so affordable. And if you liked any of the glasses that I showed before or the ones that I'm wearing, those will also be linked down below. So again, click the link in my description box below and head to GlassesUSA.com for 65% off of your first order. Thank you again so much to GlassesUSA.com for sponsoring today's video and for your continued support of this channel. As always, I will be removing my glasses for the remainder of this video because I know the glare in my glasses is very bothersome for some people. So with all of that being said, let's get into part 2 of the Korey Kauffman case. Once again, I'm going to name everybody that we discussed in part 1 and summarize how they're all connected to this. So Korey Kauffman was friends with Michael Cooley and was at his house on the night of his disappearance. Michael Cooley lived next door to the prominent defense attorney Frank Carson. Frank Carson's wife is Georgia DeFilippo, and his stepdaughter is Christina DeFilippo. Frank Carson also has represented Robert Woody, who worked at the Pop and Cork store owned by Daljeet Atwal, and his brother Baljeet Atwal. Frank Carson has also represented Daljeet in a criminal manner, and Frank and the brothers are known to be friends. Then we have the 3 highway patrol officers, Scott McFarland, Eduardo Quintanar, and Walter Wells, who are all known to hang out with the brothers at the Pop and Cork and are considered buddies and have contact with each other quite often. The police's theory at this point is that Frank had set out those aluminum irrigation pipes to lure thieves to his property. It's thought that on the night of Korey's disappearance, he went on to Frank's property to steal these pipes, but instead of getting the pipes and leaving scot-free, he was met with Frank, Baljeet, Daljeet, and Robert, who all beat him up and killed him. Then Frank Carson's wife and stepdaughter expressed that they may have known what Frank did and are trying to cover up for it. Then the Atwal brothers are thought to have worked with Walter on either killing Korey or covering it up afterwards, or both, and then with Scott and Eduardo to cover their tracks after the fact. By August 13th of 2015, Frank Carson, Georgia DeFilippo, Baljeet Atwal, Daljeet Atwal, and Walter Wells were all arrested and charged on counts of felony murder and conspiracy charges. Then Christina DeFilippo, Eduardo Quintanar, and Scott McFarland are all being charged with accessory. Then Frank Carson was also charged with perjury for lying. So, with all of that, we should be caught up, and now let's get into the rest of the case. So all 8 individuals pled not guilty, and they all adamantly denied any involvement in any of this. After the charges came out, Frank Carson's attorney said, quote, "The idea of Frank being involved in something like this is absolutely absurd. This is a man who makes $250 an hour, and he's gonna whack some clown behind a stolen pipe. I don't think so." His attorneys were also very focused and upfront about the fact that they believed that this was a politically motivated attack. Before the trial, Robert Woody had actually taken a plea deal. He pled guilty to charges of manslaughter, which left him with a sentence of 7 years and 3 months in prison in exchange for his testimony. The prosecution's entire case pretty much relied on the testimony of Robert Woody, who placed himself at the scene and claimed to have been a witness to all of this. Now, as we know, Robert originally said that Korey was beaten up, his teeth were plucked out, and he was fed to the pigs. However, the evidence goes directly against this story because Korey still had all of his teeth. Frank Carson actually pointed out that this story is pretty much an exact retelling of the movie Snatch. In that movie, there's a gangster who kills his victim and feeds him to the pigs. According to Frank, this is a very popular movie with people who do drugs often, and he thinks that the entire story was made up completely off of this movie. But either way, all 5 individuals who were being charged with murder and conspiracy all sat at the same preliminary hearing. With this type of hearing, all they have to do is bring forth enough evidence to prove that there is enough evidence to bring this case to trial. So now let's talk about the story that Robert Woody told on the stand at this preliminary hearing. Of note, Robert Woody Jr., so Robert Woody's son, also spoke with investigators to tell them what Robert had told him about what happened that night. Robert Sr. had apparently told his son about the incident only about a week after it occurred, and apparently this story was on par with what investigators were using at the preliminary hearing. This is a story that Robert officially told under oath. So, on the night of March 30th, 2012, he had been working at the Pop and Cork store with Daljeet Atwal. They left the store at 1 or 1:30 a.m. that night, and then they got into the car and they started the 1.5-mile drive over to Frank's property together. The 3 of them, so the Atwal brothers and Robert, all said that they owed Frank a favor, so they agreed to patrol his property that night. According to the prosecution, that night, Frank had stacked, I believe, 16 or so irrigation pipes on his property within view of Michael Cooley's property so that, he can make sure that Michael Cooley would see them and would be baited to come to his property and steal them. However, in another statement, it was thought that Korey actually went over there to steal an antique car that they had on the property. So I'm not exactly sure what it was or what the story was that they ended up sticking with. Robert said that by the time him and Daljeet got to Frank's property, Baljeet was already there and he had already caught Korey on Frank's property and had already started a physical altercation with him. Then Daljeet had joined the fight and the two started beating Korey together. Robert says that the two were just relentlessly beating on Korey while Korey was trying to get away. He described it like it was a cat trying to get away from a dog. Robert said that he then tried to separate the fight between them, but he was unable to, so he also turned around and started to walk away. He said that once he turned his back, he heard a gunshot. So he turned back around, and that is when he saw that Korey was already dead. Robert admitted that he was then the one who came up with the idea to get rid of his body because he was involved at that point. So they transported Korey's body to the Poppin Cork, where his fingers and toes were then cut off and placed into a black trash bag. Then the rest of his body was wrapped in a tarp, and both his body and the bag with his fingers and toes in it were buried only 18 inches deep in the ground behind the Poppin Cork. However, once investigators went over to the store to inquire about the disappearance, Baljeet realized that they needed to move the body in case, investigators came back and searched their property because obviously they didn't want them to find a dead body there. So Robert, Baljeet, and Robert's girlfriend at the time dug up Korey's body and then placed him in the back of Baljeet's truck and drove it to the foothills. He said that they ended up placing Korey's body in an area that was a little bit ways away from a dirt road, and then they scattered his fingers and toes around in the bushes. Then the day after they got rid of Korey's remains, they took Baljeet's truck and then drove it to a remote area and burned the truck. He said that Baljeet had taken a video of his car burning so that he could file an insurance claim. It was confirmed that after Korey's disappearance, Baljeet did report his truck as being stolen and did try to file an insurance claim. At the preliminary hearing, the prosecution basically said that Frank masterminded this entire plot to catch and kill thieves on his property, and they spelled out different things that they found as suspicious and came forward with different witnesses to attest to all of these things. So first of all, the prosecution pointed out about how Frank had called his mother and told his mother not to allow police to search her property without a warrant. So that showed to them that he was hiding something possibly on his mother's property. Then they talked about how Frank had hired a private investigator to look into the case, which they saw as suspicious. Why would you need a private investigator looking into a case that you have nothing to do with? Then they spoke about these witnesses that came forward to say that Frank had threatened Michael and threatened to kill him and bury him where nobody would ever find him if he ever stepped foot onto his property. Multiple people came forward to talk about how Frank had a very short temper and he could become incredibly upset and agitated very easily. They also brought up how instead of getting police involved, Frank opted to patrol his own property with his own gun. Then, when discussing Walter Wells' involvement, they brought forward the phone pings that we discussed in part 1, which showed that his phone and Korey's phone had pinged on the same towers at the same time, and that Walter's phone had pinged on the towers near Korey's house as well as near Frank's property on the night that Korey went missing. So now let's get into what the defense had to say about all of this. So again, Frank Carson is known in that county as being one of the best attorneys in their history. He was known to go against the grain, and his goal was to uncover any corruption within the Stanislaus County law enforcement. He was successful with cross-examining dishonest police officers and exposing their lies. He was apparently hated by the DA's office as a result of his many successes and pointing out the corruption and illegal tactics that they used. And again, like I said earlier, District Attorney Kirk Bunch was also involved in the Carmen Sabatino case that I previously discussed. Apparently, Frank had written declarations in both the state and federal court which sought to expose Bunch's corruption and dishonesty, and he even accused him of intimidating witnesses in that case. He said that there were cases where Bunch had manipulated evidence and deceived witnesses, and Frank didn't even believe that Bunch should be an investigator at all. So the two definitely had a history, and a lot of people thought that Bunch just had it out for Frank Carson. The next thing that the defense argued was that because of his line of work, Frank Carson was known to have some pretty dangerous affiliates. It was questioned by those who knew him why he would opt to involve his stepchild, his wife, and then two people that he saw as buddies who owned the Pop and Cork store, all in this elaborate plot. Then he was known to have this extreme distrust for police officers, so people honestly laughed at the thought that he would even think to conspire with law enforcement to carry out and cover up a crime. Instead, he had tons of trusted individuals who he had represented in the past who would be just as willing to carry out any crime for him. Again, we know that he was dealing with people who struggled with drug abuse problems, people who didn't have a leg to stand on when they were hit with their charges. Many people feel like Frank honestly saved them. So many people who didn't have a direct personal relationship with Frank would have been able and willing to do this crime instead. There were even witnesses who came forward who said, you know what? If Frank had asked me to beat up or kill these thieves on his property, I would have done it, and he knew that. But even beyond that, even with his distaste of police officers and prosecutors, Frank believed in the justice system. There was one witness who came forward who Frank had represented in the past who knew about Frank's problems with thieves on his property. This individual offered Frank to beat up these guys who were stealing from him, but Frank was adamant. He said, absolutely not. That is a boundary you will not cross. I will deal with this guy in the courts. So that aspect of it is really just a character statement saying that like Frank wouldn't do something like this. He wouldn't hire someone to kill people on his property just for like stealing his stuff. But it also shows that he has plenty of other people who would have been willing to involve themselves in this rather than him trying to involve his wife and his stepdaughter especially. Then the defense came back to talk about the prosecution's claim that, Frank had been acting out of guilt when he told his mother not to let the police search her property without a warrant, or even when Frank hired a PI. The defense pointed out that it's not fair that the prosecution is using these legal actions, which are within our rights, as proof of him somehow being guilty. Plus, we keep going back to this whole Frank having a distrust of the police. He has every right to tell his mother not to allow them to search her property without the proper documentation. Then, when it comes to him hiring a PI, he has the right to use whatever resources that he needs to in order to prevent himself from being unjustly prosecuted. The defense also said that during the initial interrogation of Robert Woody, the prosecution's star witness, the interrogators used unfair and harsh interrogation tactics to get him to admit to something false. The defense pointed out how Robert threatened to kill himself because he'd rather do that than admit to something that he didn't do. They also said that Robert told the investigators to just tell him what they wanted him to say and he would say it. They pointed out how Robert was threatened with the death penalty if he didn't cooperate. The interrogators basically said that Frank, the Atwell brothers, and everybody else involved in this are all just going to pin this all on Robert. So allegedly, the interrogator said that he needs to talk, and if he doesn't, he may be facing the death penalty. They also pointed out how Robert had changed his story multiple times. They actually found over 200 inconsistencies with his story over the year. So he should not be someone that is trusted to be the star witness in the prosecution's case. So then, beyond the focus of the defense talking about how they found criminality and things that are completely normal and the unfair interrogation tactics that they used, they also pointed to direct evidence that showed that the story that Robert was telling just does not make any sense. So the spot near the Pop and Cork where Korey was allegedly buried is near an apartment complex that directly overlooks the area. It was well lit and there were a decent amount of people who could have seen something as they were burying his body. but there was no one that ever came out to say that they saw anything suspicious or smelled anything weird in the area or noticed anything out of the ordinary. Plus, when investigators examined the area to see if they could find evidence of a body or the ground being dug up or remnants of the trash bags under the tarp, they pretty much found nothing. Plus, they talked about Frank's property and how this is the area that Korey is thought to have been shot at. Well, the area where Frank's property is in a pretty well-populated community. No one has come forward to say that they heard any gunshots or any sort of altercation going on that night. You would think a neighbor or, just another person in the town would have heard at least something from that night, but nobody said that they heard anything. And the defense pointed out how there was absolutely nothing that could be traced back to Korey on Frank's property. Upon investigation, there was no blood, no fingerprints, no hair, no clothing fibers, no sweat, spit, or anything else that could show that Korey was on the property at any point in time, let alone the night that he died. If there was this intense altercation where the two brothers were just beating up on Korey and then shot him, there would be something somewhere. This is a scrapyard. This isn't just like a normal room where you can clean it up. There's probably cracks and crevices and, bits and pieces of things everywhere. So it would be pretty difficult to clean this entire thing up of any evidence. If he was shot, there would have been blood somewhere. If there was a physical altercation, you'd think that there'd be sweat or spit or something somewhere, or a fiber of clothing or a hair that fell out, but there was none of that. Then there were discrepancies in the timeline. Michael Cooley said that Korey left his house to go out and get this scrap metal at around 10 to 11 p.m. that night. However, Robert said that the altercation and them being on the property didn't even happen until 2 to 3 hours later at 1 to 1:30 a.m. So was Korey just hanging out on the property for several hours? That doesn't make sense if he just went over there to go steal something. If you're gonna go steal something off of someone's property, you're gonna wanna be in and out in as little time as possible. You're not just gonna go there and just rummage around and hang out for 2 or 3 hours. You're gonna get out of there. So either something isn't right in the timeline, or no one really knows when any of this happened. So with all of that being said, the defense came out with a few theories of what they think could have happened instead. So first, they talked about how after Korey's remains were found, but before this information was made public, so before anybody should have known about it, Kirk Bunch and another police officer set up cameras in the area to keep an eye on that site for anyone going there or for any suspicious activity. This video ended up showing that two known marijuana growers and drug dealers, David McMillan and Jason Armstrong, were in the area where Korey's body was found before anybody in the public even knew that his body had been found. These are two individuals who Michael Cooley had told police had made threats against Korey before his disappearance. So Jason Armstrong did have a criminal history which involved domestic violence. He made his living off of buying and selling cars, and he was known to frequently throw parties at his house, which was across the street from a big empty dirt lot and only a few miles away from where Korey went missing, or Frank Carson's property. When Bunch and other investigators interviewed these two men, they did not hide their distaste for Korey. In one interview, Jason referred to Korey as a piece of shit thief, and he said that he doesn't like him and nobody else in the area likes him either. He said that it would be difficult to find anybody who likes Korey because he's always jumping over people's fences and stealing their stuff. There was also talk that Jason was involved in some biker gang and that people were afraid to cross him, so this sort of showed that he did have violent tendencies. Now, when he was being questioned, Jason said that all he does now is smoke weed. At the time of his interviews, he was 47 years old, and he said that that's too old to be beating up on anybody. But there was one witness who came forward in the months before Korey's disappearance who said that he had been beaten up by Jason that same year when Jason caught him stealing some scrap metal. So this witness coming forward had nothing to do with Korey's disappearance because it happened before he even, disappeared in the first place. It just showed that Jason was still beating up people even at the age of 47. This witness was also a friend of Korey's, so it's thought that maybe when Jason had caught this guy stealing the scrap metal, that maybe at the same time Korey was with him when he was stealing the scrap metal, so now Jason was aware of Korey and what he was involved with. So All of that to say that maybe Jason did have some sort of motive to beat up or kill Korey. In addition to this, Jason was known to frequent the Stanislaus National Forest, going more than 10 times per year, showing that he knows the area pretty well. The defense also pointed out that him and David McMillan had been heard talking about the area where Korey had been found before this information was made public. And again, they were seen in the area where his remains were found before this was made public. So how did they know about where he was buried or where he was left before the public even knew about it? However, when questioned about this, Jason said that he was just innocently hiking in the area when he had bumped into the hunter who had found Korey's remains. And the hunter told him where these remains were, and just out of curiosity, Jason went over to the area to look, but by the time he got there, he said the remains were gone and the police evidence tapes were already up. The prosecution said that after many interviews with Jason Armstrong as well as Robert Woody, they concluded that Jason was not involved. However, the defense would point out that Jason was not as harshly investigated as the defendants in this case. He was never phone tapped, he was never followed, and he never had investigators showing up on his property 2 to 3 times a day and asking him questions and snooping around his business. The defense also brought forward another witness who put forth yet another theory. This witness was currently a prison inmate named John Jose Padilla. He said that he believed that Michael Cooley had been responsible for Korey's death, and he thinks that Korey never even left Michael's property on the night that he died. John testified that he and Michael had been friends since they were kids. John had been serving some time in jail for drug use and had been released from prison on March 10th, 2012, and he said that pretty much right away he fell back into drug use. He said that he would buy from Michael almost on a daily basis, sometimes going to his house several times per day. John said that he went to Michael's house in April of 2012 with the intent to buy meth. When he was there one day, he said that Michael appeared very disturbed and anxious. John said that that day it looked like Michael was flipping out, so obviously they talked about it. And apparently Michael had told John that Korey had been caught stealing from Frank's property and that these people caught up with Korey on Michael's property. John said that Michael told him that he watched as somebody beat up and killed Korey on his property before a guy named Bobby took Korey's body away in a pickup truck. Now, Baljeet Atwal is also someone that goes by the name of Bobby, so the prosecution said that John is literally just supporting their theory of the Atwal brothers killing Korey. But John was showed a picture of the person who he thought was Bobby, who wasn't Baljeet, and he said that this is the person that he believes picked up Korey's body. So basically he identified someone else, not Baljeet, as being the one who disposed of Korey's body. Then another witness came forward to say that Michael actually told them that he had hidden a body after killing somebody over them owing him money. This witness also said that Michael appeared very nervous. It also came out that investigators found that Michael was in the possession of 13 knives on his property, but the DA investigator never examined any of them. So there was this thought that maybe Michael was actually the one responsible, but then he came up with this story of somebody coming to his property and killing Korey on his property to keep the attention away from him. Or maybe he came up with this story of Korey going over to Frank's property and them killing him, once again, to keep the attention away from him. Clearly, it seemed that there are different witnesses who say different things about what Michael had said. So, is Michael's story changing about what happened that night? Or are, these witnesses just coming forward to pin it on Michael? We don't really know. We would know more if these 13 knives were examined by the DA investigator, but they weren't. So we don't really know what to do with that. So I did listen to an interview with Michael, and he was being accused of knowing more or hiding something. And Michael just kept saying that he loved Korey and that he was his best friend and he would never do anything to hurt him. He sounded very desperate and upset in this interview. So we don't really know. We don't know if Michael was involved. We don't know if, maybe they were best friends, but something happened and he lashed out because he was on drugs. Again, we don't really know that much about Michael because police didn't really look into him, which is surprising because he was the last person to see Korey alive. So again, don't really know much, but we know that Michael was the last person to see Korey alive. We know that he might have been telling different stories about what happened that night, so just keep that in mind. So, after hearing all of this evidence in the preliminary hearing, Judge Zeninga found that there was not enough evidence against either Georgia or Christina, and their charges were completely dropped. She found that there was enough evidence to charge Walter Wells with obstruction of justice because she really did think that he was in possession of Korey's phone. However, she didn't think that there was enough to actually charge him with murder. Then, when it comes to Robert Woody's testimony, the judge said that even though his story changed, the overall story of what happened, so the bones of the story, had never changed. She said that over all of her years as being a judge, she knows that even convicted murderers, drug dealers, and robbers can sometimes tell the truth. She said that sure, Robert didn't have a formal education, but he had street smarts, so he's not just this little boy who could be convinced to admit to something that he didn't do. He was stronger than that, so she thought that he wasn't lying and that this wasn't just a case of someone using harsh interrogation tactics. So this preliminary hearing, it took a grueling 18 months to complete, one of the longest in the state's history. At the end, Judge Zeninga decided that Frank Carson, Daljeet Atwal, and Baljeet Atwal would all stand trial for murder. She did believe that Frank set this entire thing up. She said that he had threatened to kill people for going on his property, so it's not a far reach to say that he would have gone through with it. Then Scott McFarland and Eduardo Quintanar Jr. were next to sit for their preliminary hearing. The prosecution brought up these recorded phone calls between Eduardo and Daljeet, where, he basically gave him tips on how to avoid being tracked. Then they discussed how Scott McFarland had given that timeline, saying that he saw Korey riding his bike 2 days after his disappearance, which was thought to be intentional to throw off the timeline. Then, as we know, they brought up how Scott McFarland referred to Korey as a thief who needed to go. However, Judge Zeninga decided that there was not enough evidence to bring Eduardo to trial, but she did say that there was enough evidence for Scott to go to trial on these accessory charges. However, another year after this, another judge ordered that these charges be dropped against Scott because they did not think that there was any evidence to support the charges. So, Frank Carson, Daljeet Atwal, and Baljeet Atwal all stood trial together for the murder of Korey Kauffman. The trial began on April 19th, 2018, and the prosecution argued that Frank Carson wasn't necessarily present at the scene, but he could still be held criminally responsible for Korey's death. According to California law, you are still able to be convicted for first-degree murder if you did something to facilitate, promote, encourage, or instigate a murder. So now they were arguing that Frank hired the Atwal brothers to kill Korey in this whole murder for hire sort of scheme to get revenge for him stealing his stuff. As we said from before, people came forward to say that Frank had threatened to kill people for going on his property, but then there were also witnesses who came forward to say that Frank had actually tried to hire them to defend his property. Then at the trial, again, their star witness, Robert Woody, came with the same story that we discussed earlier about how him and Daljeet had been working at the liquor store together, and then they left at around 1:30 a.m. to go check on Frank's property. But when they got there, Baljeet was already there and he was already beating up Korey. Then all of a sudden, Robert heard someone shooting Korey. And then he went on to say this time that the only person who was armed that night was Daljeet. So he had to have been the one who actually shot Korey. Then they told the same story about how they buried his body originally at the Pop and Cork, but then they moved it later to avoid it being found. Then they said how Baljeet had burned his truck after transporting the body to hide the evidence. The prosecution talked about how Baljeet's truck had in fact been found burned in an orchard about a month after Korey's disappearance. Robert claimed that this was to hide the evidence of moving a body, while Baljeet admitted that this was just a scheme to collect insurance money. Then cell phone data showed that Baljeet's, Daljeet's, and Robert's phones were all within 8 miles of Korey's burial sites the day after they were contacted about Korey's disappearance. Then, of course, the prosecution brought forward witnesses to talk about the brothers' behaviors in the months before Korey's disappearance. We talked earlier about Daljeet being upset over being beat up by someone who was thought to be Korey at his store and then being laughed at. Then there was this witness that said that Baljeet and Robert had allegedly drove past Korey and said, "Your ass is grass," in a threatening manner. In addition to this, they brought forward one new witness who was also a meth user who claimed that the Atwell brothers had actually threatened Korey and then beat him up and shoved him into their trunk at some point before Korey's death. Then another witness, a prison informant, came forward to say that Daljeet had actually admitted to him to shooting Korey while Daljeet was waiting for his trial in jail. The defense came back and said that these statements are totally false and pretty much fabricated. They said that Korey didn't stop going to the Pop and Cork after this alleged assault. If he had been threatened and beat up by them, why would he continue going to their store? But at the same time, when it comes to the question of why Korey would continue going to their store after being beat up by them, that does bring up this surveillance video of someone thought to be Korey going in and punching Daljeet in his store in front of everybody. Maybe that was in retaliation to them beating him up, but we don't really know. I haven't seen that brought up anywhere else. That's sort of just something that I'm thinking of, but it's something to keep in mind with this, I guess. But then the other thing they said about the prison informant, they basically said that he was completely making up this confession so that, he could get a shorter sentence for himself. Then another witness who came forward is another drug user named Patrick Hampton. Originally, he had written a letter to investigators in January of 2015 to talk about what he knew. He said that he had met Frank back in 2011 when Frank had agreed to represent him on a probation violation. Before one of his hearings, Patrick said that he had spoken with Frank in private, in which Frank asked him if he was familiar with the people in Turlock. And then he said that Frank asked him if he knew the Cooley brothers specifically, and he said that he did know them from jail. He said that Frank then looked at Patrick's file and told him that he looks like the type of guy who can take care of shit. So Patrick claims that Frank said to him that the Cooley brothers need to be dealt with because they are robbing him blind. Patrick said that after he was bailed out from jail, he was contacted by Frank, who asked him if he ever got the chance to get at them and take care of them. Patrick said that he replied to Frank that he had taken care of them, but he didn't actually do anything. I guess he was just saying that. So this is showing that maybe Frank was going around asking people to help him deal with the Cooley brothers long before he actually carried it out with the Atwell brothers. Going off of this, Rick Cooley, Michael Cooley's brother, took the stand to talk about what he said happened. So as we said from before, the theory is that Frank had set out these irrigation pipes on his property as a ploy to lure thieves so that he could take care of them. Rick said that he noticed these irrigation pipes being laid out about 10 to 12 feet away from the fence line, and he noticed them on the day that Korey went missing. He said that the same time that he noticed these pipes, he noticed two men on Frank's property who appeared to be watching him and everybody else on the Cooley property. Then he said later that evening, he then noticed three men on Frank's property, all of which looked to be carrying rifles. Rick said that he actually did warn Korey not to go on the property because he saw these men patrolling. So Korey said that he wouldn't go there, that he would go somewhere else, but according to Rick, clearly Korey didn't listen. Then Linda Burns, who is Michael and Rick Cooley's sister, she came out to say that she also saw two men on the property that night who were carrying rifles and were watching them on their property through binoculars. So essentially she was saying that there were two men carrying rifles on Frank's property who were watching them on Michael Cooley's property through binoculars. She said that these men looked like they were hiding behind different items on the property to avoid being seen. And she also said that she remembers seeing these irrigation pipes on the property the night that Korey went missing. So now let's talk about what the defense argued with this. They said that it was absolutely preposterous that he would try to set up these thieves to come onto his property just so he could kill them. Again, as we discussed earlier, the defense said that why would he opt to use the Atwell brothers and Robert when he had so many other people who could help carry out this crime? They talked about how Robert isn't very smart and, Frank has represented some much smarter and more savvy people, so why wouldn't he choose one of them to carry out this crime? The defense also said that the prosecution is relying on testimony from drug addicts, thieves, and people who are only testifying with their own best interests in mind. Then the defense brought up how they straight up just didn't believe these witnesses who said that, Korey got beat up and shoved into the trunk by the Atwell brothers or the prison informant who claimed that Daljeet just straight up admitted to killing Korey. Then, when it came to what the Cooley family was saying on cross-examination, they actually played a recorded interview which took place during the early stages of the investigation. During this early interview, the investigator had asked Rick if he had seen these irrigation pipes on Frank's property that day, and he actually said no. So, obviously, this showed that Rick lied at some point, whether it be to investigators or on the stand. Whether he lied either way, both diminished his credibility. The same thing happened with Linda, where at some point in an interview, she also admitted to not having seen these pipes. They also brought up evidence that they were able to gather based on how Korey's remains were found. So, Korey's remains had been found with a t-shirt and a coat, which he had apparently been wearing that night. However, Robert Woody said that Korey was not wearing a coat that night, so this is just yet another discrepancy. Then Robert said that he only heard one gunshot. He didn't bring anything up about Korey being stabbed or shot multiple times. However, after examining Korey's clothes, they found a hole in the armpit of his shirt, which they think was from Korey being stabbed. Then they found 2 holes in his coat, which both appeared to be from gunshots. Then, like I mentioned earlier, they talked about how nobody in this area had heard absolutely anything. If he had been shot twice and then stabbed, how did nobody hear? How did not even Robert hear that? How did he only hear 1 gunshot? So obviously, this was very inconsistent with Robert's story and showed yet another thing that just did not line up with the evidence. Then, once again, they brought up the fact that it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to hide Korey's body at the popping cork without anybody seeing. Then, even beyond that, there was no evidence to show that anybody had even been buried there in the first place. Then, as I stated in part 1, when Korey's remains were found, they found a bullet slug near his body. The bullet slug actually did have enough DNA on it to compare it to the defendant's DNA, and it showed that the DNA on this bullet slug did not belong to any of the defendants. This DNA belonged to someone else, so don't know who it is, but it was not the brothers, and it was not Robert, and it was not Frank Carson. So now, in summary, pulling together all of the information that we heard in the preliminary hearing as well as the trial, there was no evidence to show that Korey was ever even at Frank's scrapyard to begin with. There was no evidence to show that he was ever buried at the popping cork either. The stories that all of the prosecution's witnesses were coming up with were all very inconsistent with what the evidence showed. And then let's not forget Robert's ever-changing story throughout this. The focus was largely on Frank Carson and how the people responsible for investigating this case are also people who have beef with Frank. The prosecution wants to see Frank go down for this so badly, allegedly, that they're being accused of fabricating evidence and finding meaning in things that are totally innocent just to fit their narrative. Rather than them going out and collecting all the evidence and seeing where it leads them, they had their idea and they found any evidence that supported their one theory and ignored everything else. Allegedly. The defense said that the prosecution is just completely grasping at straws and they have no evidence to show that any of these defendants had anything to do with the murder of Korey Kauffman. So, after 14 months of trial, the jury of 10 women and 2 men finally went into deliberations. They deliberated for 2 days before they came back with their verdict on June 28th, 2019. The jury came back and they found all 3 defendants, Baljeet Atwal, Daljeet Atwal, and Frank Carson, not guilty of the murder of Korey Kauffman. Now it was time for the trial for Walter Wells on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice and accessory. However, as both sides were preparing for trial, this was just continuously being delayed by continuous pre-trial motions. Judge Zaninga grew increasingly frustrated, citing that there had been so many problems along the way at the fault of the DA's office. Then, following Frank's acquittal, he actually joined Walter's legal team in November of 2019. However, just a month later, the DA's office filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Walter Wells. When they were asked why, they said no comment, but my assumption is that they were just digging and digging and digging for more evidence and they just weren't finding any. So, in the end, All parties who were named as being a part of this entire plot to lure Korey and then kill him and cover it all up, they were all exonerated.
What are the feelings, the emotions that you're feeling right now?
Relief and happy. We were always confident we should prevail, but whether we would or not, we really didn't know. The sooner that they replace the investigators in this case, the sooner they're going to find, hopefully, who perpetrated it.
All with the exception of Robert Woody, who is still serving time as a result of his plea deal. After all of this happened, of course, Korey's friends and family were all left heartbroken. They were really upset after these men were exonerated. They could be heard yelling profanities at them, screaming at them, following them out of the courtroom, and they truly believed that the men who were responsible for Korey's death were just let free. They had to sit through 18 months of preliminary hearings, 12 more months of trial, only to see nobody getting justice for killing Korey. So I can definitely understand why they would be very upset. I can understand their reaction and everything that they were just put through, all to have absolutely no closure. At the same time, the defendants were all very relieved with how this happened. Georgia went on to say, "I thought this would never end. It's like a black cloud has been lifted off of us." It's been said that this whole trial was just a mess of personal attacks and heated arguments and pointing fingers and bullying the other side. There were times where there were so many personal attacks being thrown back and forth that Judge Zaninga said that she had to ask the attorneys to leave the courtroom for 10 minutes to cool down. She said that there were times where there would be such a heated debate going on and that it would start escalating to the point that she thought that she might lose control of the courtroom. So this entire thing was just a disaster. You can tell even by the language in some of these affidavits that they are upset, that they're not happy with these charges, and that they think this entire thing is just ridiculous. Obviously, Frank Carson was very happy to be acquitted, but he said that now his reputation is ruined, and so is pretty much everybody else's who was involved in this entire thing. Eduardo's attorneys had come out to say that he was really depressed after this and that his life was basically ruined after these accusations. They said that Eduardo didn't even know Frank and there was no evidence against him to arrest him, yet he had to sit through those 18 months of a preliminary hearing, and he was let go from the California Highway Patrol, even though he ended up not being charged and he never got his job back. I also believe that Scott and Walter were let go from their CHP positions and they were not allowed back on, even though once again they were found to have nothing to do with this. Obviously, sitting in jail and having to go through all of this, especially if they really had nothing to do with it, it's just not good for your mental health. Also to note, Frank Carson had been dealing with some pretty severe health issues as the trial was going on. He started having kidney problems and he was just starting to get sicker and sicker and sicker as the stress of this trial started to take a toll on his body. He ended up suing the DA's office, saying that their officers had violated his civil rights with this entire prosecution. He cited the things that we discussed earlier, how they were ignoring evidence that didn't fit their theory and they were only bringing forth evidence that supported Frank's involvement. Frank claimed that he incurred over $3 million in legal costs as well as medical costs as the result of being in jail. He suffered with high blood pressure with severe chronic pain, and he went into kidney failure, which required dialysis as a result of his time in jail. Then, about a year after he was acquitted, Frank Carson died at the age of 66 years old after having a medical emergency while on dialysis. He was on life support before ultimately passing away on August 11th, 2020. So what we are left with is two devastated families. Obviously, Korey's family is left with no justice after he was murdered. Then Frank's family is left knowing that he most likely died as a result of him being in prison from what they think is just a political attack. We are also left with 3 highway patrol officers who lost their jobs after somehow being roped into this for doing pretty much nothing. So I think it's obvious that this entire thing was a complete disaster. I do believe that these investigators had tunnel vision, and I think that they were really focused on only finding evidence that fit their narrative. However, what I can't figure out is how or why they were able to charge so many people based on such little evidence. Literally, the only evidence that they had against two of these patrol officers, Frank's wife and his stepdaughters, were literally just phone conversations. No one admitted to any wrongdoing in any of these conversations either. They were all just assumed based on no context as to what they were saying. So it was literally like they had a conversation and then these investigators drew conclusions from what they were saying based off of, conversations that they were having, and nothing else. They found nothing else, yet they were still able to charge these people for murder and for accessory, which is crazy to me. Then they had another person whose only evidence was the fact that the phones had pinged off of the same towers. But again, it's a very small town and they frequented the same places. Clearly, Korey went to the Pop and Cork. Walter went to the Pop and Cork. Clearly, they frequented some of the same places, so it could have just been a coincidence. Or maybe it wasn't a coincidence. But either way, that one singular piece of evidence, plus someone saying, I don't like the DA, that's not enough to put someone on trial for murder. Like, that's insane to me. Then it's actually unbelievable that Georgia was charged with murder. Accessory, I could see, I guess, based off of, the very loose evidence that they had. I guess I could see accessory, but murder? Oh my gosh, I could not find any evidence that supported that whatsoever. Any evidence that I could find literally only pointed towards accessory or obstruction. But murder? I have no idea how those charges went through. So after all of this, after hearing all of the evidence, I have a couple ideas for what I think could have happened. So I do think that it's possible that the Atwell brothers could have been involved. I don't think there's enough evidence to convict them, but I do think in their case, there was enough to charge them. I also think that Robert Woody maybe knows what happened, or maybe he was directly responsible, but I don't think he acted alone. But at the same time, I do think that his confession was coerced, and I don't think that the story he told was the truth. So now if we do want to explore the possibility that it was the Atwell brothers and Robert, I do think it's possible that Frank had asked them to keep an eye on his property for thieves. And it's possible that they even went there that specific night. But do I think that Frank put out these pipes to lure thieves? No, I don't. He had so many other things on his property that seemed much more valuable. So you'd think that he would have put out something else, that more people would be willing to go steal than just pipes. I guess I don't know the area. I don't know the whole metal scrapping thing, but to me, that seems kind of strange to just put out pipes in hopes that someone would come steal them. Maybe he figured something that he should put out was something that wasn't valuable. If someone did end up stealing it, I don't really know, but I personally don't think that he put anything out there to lure anyone onto his property, especially if he already knew that people were already coming onto his property. He wouldn't have to lure anyone there because they were already going to be there. So going off of that, I do think that if the Atwell brothers ended up killing Korey that night, I don't think it was because Frank told them to. In fact, if they did kill Korey that night, I don't think that Frank knew about it unless the Atwell brothers told him about it later. So I don't think the night of he even knew about it until they told him. I think that if this is a situation that went down, I think that Korey went over there to steal something from his property because maybe, Michael had told him like, hey, this dude keeps all this stuff over there. I always get away with it. You should go see if you can get your hands on something. I think it's totally possible that that conversation was had and that Korey went over there to go steal something, and then maybe the Atwell brothers, Robert or whoever was there, confronted him, and knowing that they already had beef, especially the Atwell brothers, maybe someone lost their temper and they shot Korey. Or maybe the Atwell brothers had followed Korey back to Michael's property and shot him there, and Michael didn't want to get in trouble for having drugs or whatever he was doing on his property, so he was now roped in, and now, he had to get rid of his body. So I don't exactly know how I think all of that went down, but I do think it's possible. I think that if Korey was killed, it's possible that the brothers followed him onto Michael's property and that's where they shot him. Because honestly, I don't think that he was shot on Frank's property. but that's just me. I do think that the one thing that just keeps me coming back to the Atwell brothers is the fact that Baljeet had burnt his truck. I think it would be a hell of a coincidence if he just randomly decided to do this insurance claim right after someone went missing. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I do think that that's too big of a coincidence to ignore. So if there's anything that points me in the direction of the Atwell brothers, it's that. But going down another route, we also know that the Atwell brothers are not the only ones who have problems with Korey. Lots of people around the town were very open about the fact that Korey was disliked by a lot of people because he stole from a lot of people. So in order to have a thorough investigation, they should have looked more into Jason Armstrong and David McMillan as possible suspects. I also think that even though Michael Cooley said that him and Korey were best friends, I still think something could have happened. Whether they got into a fight while they were using drugs and things got out of control, or maybe Korey was over at Michael's house that night and someone that they both know came over and then a fight happened with this person and then they killed Korey out of a rage or whatever ended up happening. Or maybe Korey owed somebody money and they had a beef with Korey and they knew that he was going to be over at Michael's house that night, so they followed him there and they killed him. There's so many different ways that this could have gone, and I think it's truly an injustice that the investigators didn't explore every single possible route. I think that it's a huge miscarriage of justice with how little investigating they actually did, and I do believe it when people say that they didn't really care about Korey's case until they found out that Frank Carson might be involved. I think it's clear in this case that they had their sights set and they only took one route. I do think that Robert was coerced, and I do think that they harassed the Atwell brothers, and I do think that them calling their cop friends was literally just them being annoyed and upset with the cops that were constantly harassing them. Or maybe it totally was them asking for advice without telling the cops what they actually did. That's also possible, but I don't think the cops had anything to do with this. I don't think they had any knowledge. I literally just think that they were friends with the Atwell brothers, and the Atwell brothers reached out to them for help, whether they did it or not. At the end of the day, I do believe that the person responsible for Korey's murder is still out there. I think that this case needs to be investigated properly if we are ever going to find out what truly happened. I feel so bad for Korey's family, who just had to sit there and watch this entire thing become an absolute circus. I'm also frustrated because so many articles, so many of these podcasts, so many people talking about this case are only focused on Frank Carson and how things were for him. Obviously, he went through a lot. I don't think he's responsible for this. So obviously he went through a lot. He had to sit through trial. He passed away because of how bad his health issues got. But again, like I said multiple times, especially in part 1, let's not forget who this case is really about. It's not Frank's fault that, this case was mishandled, but it's also not Korey's fault. It's not his family's fault that they had to sit there and watch all of this happen the way it did. I don't think enough people are focused on Korey or what he had to go through or what his family had to go through. Call him a low-life thief or a tweaker all you want, but his family did not deserve this. They obviously didn't deserve to have their loved one murdered, but they also did not deserve to sit there and watch this entire case become a witch hunt where they completely ignored 60% of the evidence that could have truly brought a murderer to justice. This case was definitely one of the most interesting that I have looked into. I spent so much time just sitting there and reading things and trying to come up with a timeline and putting things together. And I think that there's a lot of things that simply just don't make sense. I think that there's a lot of things that were just pulled out of thin air and applied to this case. So in my opinion, if there's things in this case that don't make sense, it's because they just don't make sense. It's that simple. If there was any part of the timeline that doesn't make sense, I do apologize. I did try my best to pull everything together and make an actual timeline that makes sense. But if you go ahead and read that 334-page affidavit, you will know that they'll talk about things from 2011 and then skip to 2015 and then skip to 2014 and then go back to 2012 and then 2015 and then 2018, and it's all over the place, different people talking about different things at different times. It's kind of jumbled up. It's kind of a mess, which is one thing actually that the defense pointed to, was the fact that that affidavit was a mess and you can't really get a lot from it. But either way, at the end of the day, this case is confusing. There's things that don't make sense, and I am really excited to hear what all of you guys have to say about this case because it was a wild one. It really was. I am really looking forward to hearing your guys' theories on who you think is responsible. There's so many different possibilities, but I'm honestly curious, do you guys think that this was a political attack on Frank Carson, or do you think that he might be involved and that he knows more than he's saying? Do you think that the Atwell brothers have something to do with this? Do you think that Robert is lying, or do you think he's telling the truth? Do you think that Michael Cooley had something to do with it? Let's discuss everybody's thoughts and theories in the comments below. But either way, that is where I'm going to end today's video and the Korey Kauffman series. Thank you so much for sitting through this with me and listening to all the evidence and listening to Korey's story. I know it was a lot, but I'm glad we all got through it together. But that is where I'm going to end today's video. If you liked this video and you want to see more multi-part videos in the future, make sure you go ahead and leave this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime and mystery videos every single week. Don't forget to go ahead and turn the notification bell to on so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Don't forget to go ahead and click the link down below and head over to glassesusa.com for 65% off of your first order. Don't forget to go ahead and follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Both will be linked down below. And if you have absolutely any case suggestions, please send those suggestions over to my email at RachelShannonCases@gmail.com. With that, I hope you guys have an amazing week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!